Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday. Two great guests, Senator John Fetterman and Nathan Sales, expert on counterterrorism. Before we get into some of these heavier issues, I want to make a statement about what I see going on in Washington, D.C. I see a president of the United States who wants to refurbish and beautify the White House, memorials, even his changes that he's made to the reflecting pool. He sees things that need to be fixed, that need to be cleaned up, and he does it. I remember you couldn't walk through Washington, D.C. because there were these tent cities. They're all gone, not a single tent city. And he wanted to deal with crime. Well, the mayor didn't. So he brought in the National Guard, and crime is way, way, way down. So people say, oh, I think he was falling asleep during a meeting and so forth and so on. Those of us who know him, he doesn't fall asleep ever. And I know this because neither do I. The fact is that he's doing so many things in such a positive way, and he comes under attack for all of it. Look at the sports that he's bringing into the country. Look at all those activities that are taking place. We've got soccer here and other things going on. Just terrific, because he cares about the 250th anniversary as well. He believes in the Declaration of Independence and July 4th. All the people who attack him are the same people who've been around Washington, D.C. for decade after decade after decade, and they just let it go to hell. And they don't care. But he cares. I only mention that because my wife was a designer, my mother-in-law's a designer, and they say he's doing so many beautiful, beautiful things, and they keep attacking him. Oh, and he's falling asleep. You know, it's just pathetic. Just pathetic. Well, a memorandum of understanding has been signed. You know, the success of any deal, whether it's a deal with Iran or anybody, is not the deal itself, but compliance with the terms and the conditions of a deal. Have you ever entered into a contract? Well, it doesn't mean anything if the other side doesn't comply with it or they don't intend to comply with it, right? There needs to be punishment, fines, penalties built into any such deal. So the question I have with all the debate swirling around and so forth and so on, how will compliance be addressed and enforced beyond the Trump presidency? Isn't that the bottom line? Understanding further negotiations are to lead to a final deal. I am seeing precious little discussion or reporting or official statements about how the MOU or a final deal would be enforced to ensure compliance. In the end, this determines whether any deal can or will hold. Now, my view is you can put in whatever terms you want. This enemy is not going to comply after the Trump administration. And I don't think I'm wrong in the least. But if people think I'm wrong and they're working on a deal, let's see it. The enemy and its Hezbollah proxy violated the ceasefire on a daily basis. On a daily basis. And I suspect they'll do this when it comes to the deal, the final deal, after the president has left office. And if the Iranian regime violates the deal, what are we going to do about it? What options are on the table that are realistic and that will be used, that are enforceable? Let's say there's a temporary change in their behavior in exchange for the sanctions relief and the billions flow back into the regime. And then the regime decides, okay, we have what we want and we will do what we want. Now, what are you going to do about it? Isn't that a rational scenario? Isn't that the evidence of the past? You know, these are very serious issues that need to be wrestled with now, not force people into silence or cheering or booing or anything else. This isn't a baseball game. This is life and death. And it will surely become important in any final deal. And Congress is going to review it because that's not discussed either. Yes, Congress will have to look at this. And most importantly, they're going to look at whether this deal can be upheld, I suspect. Now, this should be treated as a treaty under the Constitution for we constitutional conservatives. But Obama and Congress, Democrats and all Republicans but one, Tom Cotton, all of them decided not to apply the treaty requirements under the Constitution to the Obama-Iran nuclear deal. So that's where we are. Now, what does the Constitution actually say if it was followed? Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. The president shall have power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. The Senate, 2/3 of the senators present concur. Well, Obama realized he couldn't get that. So he conspired not only with his party, but the Republicans to get around it. Because that's a high bar. And it's set intentionally as a high bar by the framers of our Constitution to ensure that any arrangement and any agreement with a foreign power is so beneficial to our country that it not only passes with the support of Congress, but we're going to call it a treaty, and the Senate, which represents the states, at least theoretically, can only approve it with a supermajority. Now listen to this. The deal now, like the precedent set by Obama and the Republicans and Democrats in Congress, will require Congress to prevent the deal by 2/3 of both houses. In other words, it's flipped. It's flipped. The process is flipped. So it's highly likely that this deal, despite the hostility of the Democrats and objections by some Republicans who don't believe a deal should be going through at all, it's likely it'll sail through because that's the way the system was perverted. But that also means that it will not be binding on any future president or Congress because it's not a treaty. In addition to what I believe is an evidentiary certainty that the Iranian regime will not comply with any deal and unquestionably will violate it after President Trump leaves office in about 3 years, give or take, there's no question that if a Democrat becomes president, this is the reality. And also most Republicans. How do I know that? Well, look at the presidents prior to Donald Trump. Did anybody do anything to even enforce other agreements that Iran was in, like the non-proliferation agreement on nuclear weapons? Nothing serious. There are other very serious and consequential matters that I hope will be addressed. Maybe they are, but we've not seen the exact terms and nobody has publicly stated them. What will the status of Iran's ballistic missile production be? That is the most powerful conventional weapon they have, and even without nuclear weapons, they can destroy cities not only in Israel. We witnessed what they did to Arab countries and their precious oil industries, but now we know they can reach Europe and Europe's capitals, and eventually our country. Won't take much time to figure that out with the help from the Communist Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Russians. I don't believe they're part of this deal. And I don't believe they give a damn what kind of deal we enter into, quite frankly. I've not seen much reported on this. I've not seen anything reported on this. This is a hard issue to be negotiated in any definitive way, isn't it? What kind of language will stop them? But at least we ought to make the effort. And are we committing to protecting Hezbollah should it continue to attack Israel? As we discussed on last night's program, Hezbollah has slaughtered our Marines, our soldiers, our sailors, and American citizens. This is not just some far-off terrorist regime. It has slaughtered Lebanese individuals. It has slaughtered Syrians because it used to fight for Assad. It has slaughtered Iranians because it used to help that regime because the regime owns Hezbollah. And of course, it has murdered Israelis. Are we committed to protecting Hezbollah so it can continue to attack Israel and continue to brutalize the people in Lebanon? This is the lifeline that Iran is depending on. Well, if we are, then this deal won't stand. It won't stand for long, even during the Trump presidency. Israel will not be able to adhere to what would be a suicide pact. The Israeli people won't put up with it. The Prime Minister won't put up with it. We should not accept it either. Because remember, Hezbollah has attacked us. And when Israel is forced to defend itself, including preemptively against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and remember, they're not at war with Lebanon, they have a peace deal with Lebanon. They've never been at war with Lebanon. And it is said to be in violation of the deal. We saw this play out earlier, providing the Iranian regime with a strategic opportunity to attack Israel, claiming it's defending its ally, and that Israel violated the deal. What then? Will Israel become a pariah? And will it be admonished? Iran's counting on it, and so is Hezbollah. Hezbollah must not be in the deal. It must not, and that must be very clear. But to me, and at this stage, it's not very clear, despite some of the language that's been put out in anonymous briefings of certain media by administration officials. I'm just asking questions that will eventually be asked and subjected to scrutiny. So it's something that needs to be seriously considered. And what about the Iranian people? Am I not supposed to bring them up? Did we not urge them to continue rising up and protesting? And they've paid a horrible price for resisting this murderous regime. So what now? I've not heard a lot about this either. That's not to say it won't be addressed in the final deal. I hope it is. It seems impossible to square the survival of the regime, even the eventual strengthening of the regime as sanctions are lifted and other countries pour billions of dollars into the regime, which I believe is contemplated here in one form or another. I'm not certain, with supporting the liberation of the Iranian people. If the regime survives and even becomes stronger, how do you square that with the liberation of the people? I personally believe this should be a top priority, and I've mentioned this for months. Arm the Iranian people till I'm blue in the face. And let's be very clear about this. To those who say it cannot be done, you are wrong. I dug up an article from 1986 in the LA Times. Reagan Doctrine seen as a policy watershed. President's support for freedom fighters aims at reversing communism gains around the world. It says, what began several years ago when President Reagan penciled the word freedom fighters into the margins of a staff-written speech is now being heralded in Congress and elsewhere as a watershed in U.S. foreign policy. This was 40 years ago. A pledge that the United States will come to the aid of third world anti-communist resistance groups around the globe. Remember, we were up against the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons, that had massive numbers of tanks, millions of men in uniform and so forth and so on, that was ubiquitous around the world, that could reach from one continent to the other. Here we're dealing with Iran. Okay, we're dealing with Iran. As dangerous as Iran is, it's not the Soviet Union. It goes on. Reagan portrays these rebel groups as freedom fighters engaged in a global struggle by Western nations to roll back the 1970s expansion of Soviet influence in the Third World. Critics portray the policy as a dangerous one, which will eventually draw U.S. troops in another war like Vietnam. It didn't, did it? It destroyed the Soviet Union. The policy has been so closely identified with the president that supporters and critics alike now refer to it as the Reagan Doctrine. We seek to give effective support to those who have taken the initiative to resist Marxist-Leninist dictatorships so they can struggle for freedom, the president said. It is justified because of the threat that those regimes pose to their neighbors, our allies and friends, and our own national security. And later, the Reagan Doctrine has gained so much momentum that representatives of a variety of third world counterinsurgencies now flock to Washington for frequent meetings. I remember all this. I was there. I was there when this took place, and it was very effective. I don't know if we've lost the will to do this. I don't know if it's because we don't seek the overthrow of this regime. I don't know if our intelligence agencies are up to it anymore. I don't know. I've heard the president talk about the Kurds. I've read where Erdogan did not want us to do this. I've heard all of that. I'm talking about arming the Iranian people. And I don't give a damn if Erdogan likes it, if Saudi Arabia likes it, or Qatar likes it or not. They are not our friends. Certainly not from where I sit. Now, to put it all in context, though, all of this in context, President Trump is the only president in half a century to unleash our military, working side by side with our closest ally, Israel, and their great leader, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Unleashed both of their militaries, us working side by side to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, not once but twice, and their uranium facilities. And lest we forget, the Democrats, the media, and the isolationists viciously smeared our president for it. And they did the same to Netanyahu. Even certain people in this administration urged him against taking military action, on the record and off the record. These people were wrong, and they've been proven wrong. And if they had succeeded and our president had not acted, Iran would have nuclear warheads as I speak, and perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 ballistic missiles with which to blackmail not only the Middle Eastern countries, not only Israel, but Europe and our country. There are these same voices who demanded an immediate cessation of military action because the price of gasoline went up, who demanded that we find an off-ramp right away, who insisted that we cut and run. Do we Americans cut and run? I sure hope that's not what our generation is all about. That certainly wasn't what my father and grandfather's generations were all about when both of them volunteered during World War II. So we would not be in a position today to even discuss next steps, deal or no deal, terms and conditions, and all the rest. But for the unparalleled leadership of our president, even in the face of this opposition, joined with the unparalleled leadership of Israel and its prime minister, and Pete Hegseth, who throughout the early days of this war kept complimenting. I remain very skeptical about any deal. I am not here to sabotage anything. I'm here to talk to you, the American people. We also have a right to an opinion. And my opinion is we have a great president. My opinion is we have a horrific enemy. I trust our president. I certainly don't trust the enemy. We'll be right back.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.